Hello everyone and welcome to the next episode of the Old and Word book series of book reviews. You may notice it's a little bit darker actually, it's midnight. Suitable for the next book review though. This is the Roarings from Further Out. It's a collection of 4 weird novellas by Algernon Blackwood, edited by Xavier Aldana Reyes. It's part of the British Library Tales of the Weird collection. I could have reviewed each of these novellas separately, but I want to review just this collection as a whole instead of standalone, just to give a feel for the author. Instead of picking apart each one, I will go for the pros and cons of each novella. Actually, I feel like that's probably the best way to progress, but didn't want to go and devote an entire review just to The Wendigo or Ancient Sorceries, for example. But let's get into the character of Blackwood. Blackwood was quite an interesting person. He was a member of a lot of different groups. I believe he was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. He was a pantheist. He was into Rosicrucianism. All sorts of supernatural beliefs. Fair enough. Not my sort of thing. Although I am quite interested in some aspects of pantheism, I suppose. What matters to me though is that he was a member of the Weird Tales sort of literary group, I suppose. He was inspirational for Lovecraft. A lot of his stories deal with sort of anti-anthropocentrism, which I'm quite interested in. I say quite, that's quite an understatement actually. It's one of my driving interests, I suppose, in terms of literature. I'm going to start off with the first novella in chronological order, The Willows, written in 1907. The Willows is considered his most famous novella by far. Lovecraft considered it possibly the best weird tale ever written, I think it was, or the best shorts for him, but possibly the best short story ever written. I'm not sure he went that far. Either way, The Willows for Lovecraft was quite significant. I believe it inspired him quite a lot. The Willows, for me, maybe blasphemous to say, but I didn't enjoy it as much as some others in this collection. It's about 2 travellers travelling down the Danube River, somewhat similar to the image in the background. The primary focus of the novella is the traveller's perception of nature and the traveller's perception of the willows that surround them. They come into what they feel is an uninhabited region beyond civilization, and they feel that they've disturbed the order of things, especially the main character. We have one pragmatist and one more imaginative soul, I suppose, and a lot of Blackwood's fiction is like that, sort of this dichotomy between the one who can perceive and the one that's pragmatic, I suppose, and maybe a little bit more close-minded, I suppose. So it's these travellers. I won't get into the spoilers. The thing about Blackwood is that it really hinges on the atmosphere and just going into it blind, I suppose. All that you should probably know is that there are 2 characters travelling down the Danube, experiencing strange sensations and entities that appear that perhaps give them not just feelings of horror and fright, but also majesty and awe. That's one of the things that's interesting about Blackwood. He's not like Lovecraft. It's not entirely misanthropic. Blackwood also deals with almost more positive aspects, although a lot of the time, which is quite interesting to me, Blackwood does hint that man's encroachment into nature and the anthropogenic disturbance is the cause of the things that happen in the stories. But there's almost a positive element, especially in this novella in The Willows. There's a scene where the main character almost gets on his knees and he's stunned by what he sees in this landscape of the Danube. One of the things is that I quite enjoyed the character development what Blackwood isn't known for his characters. It's more of a sort most of his work is focused on the nature element and the soaking in the landscape and the feeling of nature. I think the thing that most people enjoy about it is the sense of encroaching fear. It starts off very slow. They're just travelling through the Danube. They're travelling into this wilderness, and then they eventually see things that change their way of thinking, I suppose you could say. And they start getting into arguments, and it feels a very solid story. Although one of the things near the end, not getting into spoilers, one of the things near the end is that I was a little bit confused about what Blackwood's conception of these different entities that appear. It's not just the willows that are the cause of the horror and the majesty. There are other elements as well. One particular element, I didn't quite think that cohered quite as well as it should have. I'll put it out there that there are bronze figures that appear. That's all I'll say. But I didn't feel like those connected with the willows. I didn't quite see maybe there's some symbology or symbolism that I'm missing there. But I'll leave it at that. Overall, it encapsulates Blackwood. If there's one story that you read, that you want to read from Blackwood, read The Willows. It definitely encapsulates his sort of pantheistic outlook. Our meal was beyond question a gloomy one, and we ate it almost in silence, avoiding one another's eyes, and keeping the fire bright. Then we washed up and prepared for the night, and, once smoking, our minds unoccupied with any definite duties, the apprehension I had felt all day long became more and more acute. It was not then active fear, I think, but the very vagueness of its origin distressed me, far more than if I had been able to take it and face it squarely. The curious sound I have likened to the note of a gong became now almost incessant, and filled the stillness of the night with a faint, continuous ringing rather than a series of distinct notes. At one time it was behind, and at another time in front of us. Sometimes I fancied it came from the bushes on our left, and then again from the clumps on our right. More often it hovered directly overhead like the whirring of wings. It was really everywhere at once, behind, in front, at our sides and over our heads, completely surrounding us. The sound really defies description. But nothing within my knowledge is like that ceaseless, muffled humming rising off the deserted world of swamps and willows. The next novella is called Ancient Sorceries. This one I don't believe it's too well liked, although the last one in this collection is probably the least liked, I suppose. I really quite enjoyed Ancient Sorceries, at least the first half. So it's a masterwork of atmosphere and slow prose. Most of Blackwood's writing is actually very slow. It's hard to pin down. It's about a man a sort of timid man who gets off a train one day in a French town, and someone tells him in French, he hears the last couple of words, because of the cats, because of the sleep. That's all he hears. And he enters a strange town, and almost nothing happens, but it's impressive the way that Blackwood writes this story, at least in the first half. It's a very lethargic town where almost nothing happens. He's just wandering through this very sleepy town where the inhabitants, as you might have guessed from the previous reference, aren't quite what they seem. There's a sense of almost ephemerality to the people in the story. They're in the background. This character, Arthur Vezin, is exploring this French town, and he's almost staying on in the town because he feels like something has to happen. He feels like something's going to awaken inside of him, and that's actually part of the eventual the climax, that he has something in him that relates to these people in terms of the past, in terms of history. And I found the start of this book is it's a masterwork of slow writing, slow prose. It's about, I guess it's about perceptions of people, and they almost feel these people that are in the background in this town. you're not quite sure whether or not they're evil or not. They almost watch him in a very sort of passive way. It's a very passive story. You'll have to read it for yourself. But then eventually things become more concrete. I really enjoyed the start where he gets off this train and he's in this very sleepy, lethargic town. Actually, that's a good point. It reminds me a lot of Shadow over Innsmouth by Lovecraft. Not in the sense of that it's nowhere near as action-packed and it's nowhere near as edgy and dark as Innsmouth, but definitely not. But there's a sense of maliciousness in the inhabitants, but you're not quite sure if they are truly malicious or not. However, it then becomes more concrete, as I was saying before. It then becomes more concrete, and we have, unfortunately, it's not really spoilers to say, we have things like witches and Satan is mentioned. I don't really find that sort of thing interesting. And then at the end, unfortunately, it just falls completely flat, where a character called John Silence, and I should say, this story is part of it's a frame story where I believe Blackwood wrote a character called John Silence, who's a sort of psychic detective. I find a lot of writers in the old era, they have their main stories, the stories that they write, and then they have someone like John Silence. They have the York and Club stories from Dunsany. Who else? For some reason, that's the only ones that are coming to the top of my head, but they're club stories, I suppose. A certain someone who helps people or who relays stories, and there's a lot of stuff like that. It also reminds me of Turn of the Screw, actually, where they're sitting listening to a story. Anyway, going on a tangent, but this character John Silence, who is some of a Sherlock Holmesian psychic detective, he features in other stories, and basically at the end he just completely demolishes the story by explaining every single thing in a weird sort of exposition scene. And it's not really spoilers to say, really, to be honest. Well, you read it for the start, basically. And it feels to me like an anti-weird story at the end, an anti-weird conclusion. I'm pretty sure weird tales are supposed to be ambiguous and atmospheric, not just completely demolishing it by explaining every single thing. The spirit of this silent hill town, remote from tourists and motor cars, dreaming its own quiet life under the autumn sun, rose up and cast its spell upon him. Long before he recognized the spell, he acted under it. He walked slowly, almost on tiptoe, down the winding narrow streets where the gables all but met overhead. And he entered the doorway of the solitary inn with a deprecating and modest demeanour that was in itself an apology for intruding upon the place and disturbing its dream. At first, however, Vizin said, he noticed very little of all this. The attempt at analysis came much later. What struck him then was only the delightful contrast of the silence and peace after the dust and noisy rattle of the train. He felt soothed and stroked like a cat. Like a cat, you said, interrupted John Silence, quickly catching him up. Yes, at the very start I felt that, he laughed apologetically. I felt as though the warmth and the stillness and the comfort made me purr. It seemed to be the general mood of the whole place, then. The third novella, second last, is The Wendigo. Probably my favourite of the lot, actually. Set in the Canadian backwoods. About, if you've not guessed already, about the Wendigo, the quite culturally iconic Wendigo, who is supposed to be related to cannibalism, actually. His legend, or its legend, is supposed to be related to cannibalism. Blackwood makes it his own, though, in this one. Really, it's supposed to be a personification of in the story it's called the personification of the wild, the personification of the call of the wild. This one I felt very strongly, it was quite confident writing. I felt like it was almost the peak of his writing, actually. I felt like this is what Blackwood can do. It's really incredible atmosphere. Like, it's a word that I'm going to bandy about quite a lot, atmosphere, but it really is. The best possible thing that I can say about the book, the novel, is that we really get a sense of the main character's struggle through the woods to to find someone that's taken by the Wendigo. We really do get a sense of his struggle in the wilds. Really quite some harrowing scenes actually. It definitely feels like it's the most action-packed of Blackwood's stories that I've read anyway. Obviously I've only read 4, but definitely of this collection, it's by far the most action-oriented. One of the things I'll say is that the characters are a little bit too flat. That's one of the main things that people say that's negative about the novella. Of course we have to take into account the time it was written and all that. I don't really, for me it's not much of a problem. I just take the writing as it is, but in this story there are various racial stereotypes that are, for me, what is by the by, but for me, I mean, they kind of feel lazy, I suppose. The natives are the ones that are more in touch with the wilds. Fair enough. If they're more around nature most of the time, if it's their culture, if it's their way of life, of course they're gonna feel like that. But in terms of the actual writing, though, it does feel a little bit lazy. It's also just a little thing, but a line that's said a few times in the story is a little bit camp. It's a little bit unnecessary as well. It's sort of takes you out of the horror atmosphere. Something that a victim of this power in the wild says. It almost feels like he's broadcasting what's happening to him, and you'll know what that is when you read the story. It feels a little bit. At the time I thought it's quite interesting, but it's actually, I think silence would have been best, really. So the Wendigo is definitely probably my favourite, and actually something I forgot to mention is that one of the 2 characters actually, Dr. Cathcart and his nephew, are Scottish actually. That's quite interesting. Anyway, the story is definitely more action-packed, and it's definitely more gripping than the others. And Simpson, scarcely knowing what he did, presently found himself running wildly to and fro, searching, calling, tripping over roots and boulders, and flinging himself in a frenzy of undirected pursuit after the caller. Behind the screen of memory and emotion with which experience veils events, he plunged, distracted and half deranged, picking up false lights like a ship at sea, terror in his eyes and heart and soul, for the panic of the wilderness had called to him, in that far voice, the power of untamed distance, the enticement of the desolation that destroys. He knew in that moment all the pains of someone hopelessly and irretrievably lost, suffering the lust and travail of a soul in the final loneliness. And the final novella for this review is The Man Whom the Trees Loved, one of the ones that are not as well reputed, I suppose. However, I found this story quite engaging, actually. Although, first thing to say is that it's far too long. It's about 80 pages, far longer than any of the other stories, especially because it does have a brooding atmosphere, of course, like all Blackwood stories. It deals with a couple in a New Forest cottage. Used to live near the New Forest, so it's quite interesting to read. The wife is a Christian bigot, actually, and the husband is a pantheist, I believe. You can tell he's a sort of insert for Blackwood. At least that's my view of it anyway. Things start off with an invitation to an artist who has painted a picture of I believe it's a cedar Lebanon tree outside their cottage, facing the woods, and we eventually find out that the husband has quite a lot in common with this artist, who the wife, this Christian, and it's not, by the way, it's not too far-fetched or too extreme to say that she's a bigot. Actually, Blackwood you can tell he does not like this character, although the wife actually is the main focus of the story, and she's portrayed in quite a sympathetic light as well. But the artist, to get back to the artist character is influential on the husband, because they both have a love of nature and the trees, specifically in the New Forest. And she is highly suspicious of this. I found the characters highly developed. It's such a long story where almost nothing happens but character. It doesn't feel like a weird tale, though. It's definitely not a weird tale. in the sense that it's really not ambiguous. Almost everything that happens is overanalyzed and it's very repetitive as well. It's a weird thing because I was about to say it's my least favourite story, but the way the atmosphere sort of builds up over it's quite considerable length of time. Just in this cottage is really quite interesting. Although it's a lot of philosophizing, it's a lot of just talk. They just sit and talk for most of it. You can tell it's almost an essay. It's an extended essay, and you can see the end coming a mile away as well. In terms of what happens to the husband. Although there's definitely something quite creepy about it's almost. So I'll just say that the character is drawn to the woods, not so much because he loves the trees and feels he needs to defend them. It's almost actually the opposite way around, which is almost quite creepy in a way. The trees love him and try to draw him in. And most of the story deals actually with the wife's perspective and her struggle with trying to accept the husband's way of life and the way he basically he's out in nature all the time, and their sort of the relationship disintegrates over time. Although I read a review, it bugs me. I read a review saying that the characters were flat. I don't see how they're flat at all. The wife, even though she's a bigoted Christian, she also tries to see things from his perspective, and there's all these different linkages. I found it really quite impressive. I kept saying, this is actually very well, it feels real, definitely feels real. It might almost be one of the most melancholy stories I've ever read. I read the last couple of pages very early in the morning, couldn't get to sleep, and I read this, and I just kept saying, Jesus, this is very melancholy and very sad for the wife. Yeah, it's an odd one though. It's probably the slowest story I've ever read. It's very interesting though. Could have done more on the artist though. He's just he's inserted there, and he starts the story, and we get why how he influences the husband, but he sort of just disappears, I suppose. Maybe it makes him seem more like he's one of these strange, weird tale sort of elements himself, where he comes in, changes the character, the husband then leaves. And also the last thing I'll say is that the story's an omniscient perspective, and it's a little bit strange because we get both the husband and the wife's perspective on things, even though it's mostly focused on the wife, but we're also getting little bits of detail from the husband as well, so it feels a little bit muddled as well. And the ending, not that satisfying for how long it builds up. But anyway, I found it really quite sad actually. It's definitely worth a read. And she went about her daily duties with a calm and quietness that was a perpetual astonishment even to herself, for it hardly seemed of this world at all. She talked to her husband when he came in for tea after dark. Resignation brings a curious large courage when there's nothing more to lose. The soul takes risks and dares. Is it a curious shortcut sometimes to the heights? David, I went into the forest too this morning, soon after you, I went. I saw you there. Wasn't it wonderful? He answered simply, inclining his head a little. There was no surprise or annoyance in his look, a mild and gentle ennui rather. He asked no real question. She thought of some garden tree the wind attacks too suddenly, bending it over when it does not want to bend. The mild unwillingness with which it yields. She often saw him this way now, in terms of trees. It was very wonderful indeed, dear, yes, she replied low, her voice not faltering though indistinct. But for me it was too strange and big. The passion of tears lay just below the quiet voice, all unbetrayed. Somehow she kept them back. So that was Algernon Blackwood, 4 weird novellas edited by Xavier Aldana Reyes. Definitely worth the read, I think. So thanks for watching everyone. I'll see you until the next episode.